I'm Dan Schawbel, managing partner of Workplace Intelligence, and in this series, I talk to leaders about their perspectives on hybrid work. My guest today is Shane Pearlman, CEO of Modern Tribe, a fully distributed digital agency that develops custom solutions for the world's top companies. Shane, it's great to have you here.
It's a pleasure.
Why did Modern Tribe originally decide to be remote, and how has that decision impacted the company?
Sure. So we've always been remote, and that was because between 2000 and 2002, I experienced the dot-com bust from a front row seat. Got laid off 5 times in 2 years. And so after that, when I started freelancing and decided to start a business, I was obsessed with the idea of creating something that was economically flexible. That if you had to go through big ups and big downs, that those big downs wouldn't topple you. And so we've never had an office. We from the very start of our company, we were a cooperative of freelancers, and those freelancers weren't in the same place. So if you've got one person in Minneapolis, one person in Rome, one person in California, like what good does an office do you?
The answer is not much. But that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that, you realize that you didn't want to incur the cost of leasing an office for a year or more than that. And, by not having that type of an expense, if anything were to happen, a pandemic, a future crisis, you'd more likely survive it because you had fewer expenses as you're growing your company.
And had the flexibility. I mean, a lot of this was tied to a business model around independent contractors. And it was very organic. I mean, I don't mean to make it sound like it was some giant master plan. 20 years ago, I was just trying to figure out how to like pay my rent.
What are some of the benefits and drawbacks of running a remote company from the Canary Islands?
Sure. On the labor side, I have access to a global talent pool. Like it doesn't really matter to me where people work. For a long time, that had economic advantages to it too. But the reality is, we made a decision fairly early on that it didn't really matter to us where you worked. We were willing to pay for a result, and so we set a benchmark that was location independent. It also gave us access to not just like a global talent pool, but a whole talent pool of people where part time and home was a requirement for their life. Maybe they were homeschooling, maybe they had life issues or parent issues or health issues that made it, but they were just incredibly capable. And so it also gave us a retention advantage. If your best life is in a small remote town in the middle of nowhere, we were some of the best game in town. And so it really allowed us to connect with people. It also allowed us to design a work style around flexibility. There's a lot of people who have this idea that work is 9 to 5, but when you don't care about time zones, it sort of frees you up to design your work around your best life. There's a lot of people whose peak energy levels at 11 o'clock at night. There's other people who are morning people. And so this idea that work happens in this weird slot based on where you live is a little silly. And so being able to design it, so we had to make decisions. We had to say, every team we have has to overlap by 3 hours. That's a rule. Just through a lot of experience, we've learned you need to at least be able to count that somebody's there at some point. But beyond that, we were really comfortable. Like I actually break my workday into two. I work from about noon to about 5. I hang out with my kids till they're to bed, and I work from 8 to about 11. And that's because I like to surf in the morning, hang out with my wife when the kids aren't here, and enjoy my time. And so designing it that way was a choice. Um, from a downside perspective, the biggest challenge of remote work is how to foster empathy between people. It's really easy when you're like really stressed and you're on deadline, or maybe it has nothing to do with work. Maybe your life is crazy, but and you're real stressed, to start to assume the worst in people. It's a little bit of human nature, I'm sad to say. And a lot of that, humans usually deal with it by looking at your eyes and being like, oh yeah, or going out and having beers or laughing together. And so the amount of energy it takes to design workflows and culture is a lot higher. You can't sort of hope your office culture works out positively. Now, most people who are building big businesses know it doesn't actually work out on its own anyways. You have to put a huge amount of energy, but when you go remote, the types of things you do are just different. um, there are a lot of people who are like, well, it must be a lot cheaper to be remote, and I was like, well, in all reality, we probably spend nearly as much money on culture building as we would on an office. Between going on retreats, between like a lot of the activities that we do to connect people, building tools and systems, like um, we built a, I want to call it like a fiat currency of tacos. So that somebody, like, if you see somebody do something great that you're like, thank you, that was awesome, or you went up above and beyond, we can give tacos. And you can give up to 5 tacos a day. And and it was an open source project that they eventually commercialized. We forked and did our own thing, but a lot of it was tied back to cultural values we have. And so you'll give a taco and you'll be like, hey, that person, like, wow, that was really curious and amazing, or that was super accountable. um, the other challenge besides sort of empathy is accountability. I have a lot of people ask me, are like, can anybody work remote? And I'm like, yes, but not necessarily well or happily. It takes a certain amount of self-management, and some people just like enjoy that better. There are also people who frankly just thrive in a physical space. My wife's one of them. She worked remotely for Google for a while and she was miserable. And then she went back to being presential and was just gobs happier. And so doing that, but building workflows and patterns to drive accountability. Like in our maybe 10 years ago, I was tracking every successful and every failed team member who came in and out, how many interviews. Like, I was really paying attention to what it was. And ultimately we noticed that about 2 out of 5 people worked out long term. And that out of the 3 who didn't, it was rarely technical skill that did them in. Every so often it was their ability to set expectations well, to coordinate. Accountability isn't just, I'll do what I say I'm going to do. It's the ability to look at a set of circumstances and be like, wait, something's not right here. There are expectations I can't deliver on, or you know what? Everybody's missing the fact that my grandmother's sick. And if something goes wrong, I might have to go out. Do we have a plan to cover that scenario so that nobody's left hanging? People who really are ultimately successful in remote work have a bit of that, but also have a lot of patterns and practices to support those behaviors that make accountability more successful.
All good points. One of the things that I've noticed as I've talked to CEOs like yourself is that while now you can, recruit from everywhere and you have this expansive, diverse talent pool, because more companies are becoming more remote and decentralized, you actually have competition now in a way in which you probably didn't maybe 2 years
really
ago.
Noticeable. It's not even subtle. And it's challenging too, because a lot of companies out there are trying to figure out their price point on talent. And some of the companies are running around using price points that are out of reach for an organization like mine on talent. And so it's hard when Stripe's out there, and we never fished in the same ponds until suddenly we did. And that's genuinely created a business challenge for me organizationally. What it did though was force us to get more creative. As a result, we have a much more diverse applicant pool because we've had to go fishing in places we originally didn't.
Makes sense.
Which has been kind of cool.
And one of the other things you probably have to play up is the company culture. Do you mind describing your corporate culture and what makes it unique and some of the challenges and opportunities with building it remote?
Yeah. So our culture is designed around the idea of flexibility, and it's an obsession. And that means a lot of things. That means that some of the way that we design work and time, the way we design benefits has a lot to do that. At the end of the day, we look for people who are happy, helpful, curious, and accountable. Happy, and I don't mean Pollyanna happy. I mean that that if I'm going to hang out with you as much or more than I hang out with my wife, and I chose my wife very, very carefully, then I would like to know that you bring a positive energy into our interactions. Um, we're a service business. Like our entire purpose of being is to bring value and solve human problems. Like a lot of people are like, "Oh, you're an agency, you build websites," and I'm like, "Oh, kind of." What we actually really do is we solve business problems. We happen to use technological tools about 3/4 of the time. And a quarter of the time we don't. It's a mixture of therapy and coaching and whatever else it takes in order to navigate the set of business workflow and practice challenges that an org is facing. And so this sort of like obsession with being helpful, adding value, understanding that nobody's paying us for an hour of our time, that it's a meaningless measure. They're paying us for an outcome. And happy, helpful, curious, like our tech changes so fast. And if you're not somebody who enjoys the process of constant self-education, very quickly you're going to find yourself in a bunch of friction. Like our business happens to be in an industry that your skill set from 4 years ago is not that relevant anymore. And so, like, unless you like the process of reinvention, you're going to get frustrated and unhappy, and accountable. And
And
that
we're literally gonna say that about every industry moving forward, though, don't you think?
maybe
There's
I
so much
think
change, more so, some more so than others, but I feel like the ability to adapt to change and continuously learn is going to be even more important as things move more rapidly.
I agree. I don't know. I have to believe that as a general level, the skills of therapy have enough sort of long-term valid foundation. I mean, in a way, like the practices of object-oriented programming are still relevant despite the tech changing. So you might have sort of a principle versus practice scenario where your practices might change, but the principles are sort of long-term and hold. But I think each industry goes through its sort of accelerated changes in different cycles. You've got your discovery phase, your adoption of a new set of practices, workflows, tech stack. Then there's a consolidation and domination phase. I mean, if you look, WordPress, for so many years, people kept thinking, well, I guess WordPress got big. Yeah, that's probably the end of it. And somehow it still managed to continue to drive and pick up a larger and larger share of the way the internet works. So there are things that have 10, 15, 20 years worth of longevity to them.
Yeah, and you were talking about accountability, and I think this is really important because you got to get business done no matter where people are working, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you ensure
Yeah.
that these remote workers are accountable and aligned to your mission, goals, and values?
Yeah. There's a mixture. One of the things that we started with is making sure teams are aligned. So one of the practices, I got this from a crew over at Evernote a number of years ago and borrowed it. We had our own sort of like less organized version, but they have a team charter. And so we do now. And that team charter is a set of understandings among the team on how you're going to work. In our case, we allow our teams to work differently. Like it's fine. If one team wants to communicate in a way, take time off in a different way, that's fine as long as it's well coordinated. And so that practice talks about things like, if I have a question, how do I ask it? How long do I need to wait until I know that it's okay to ask again? When you think about the difference between an extrovert and an introvert, one of the biggest challenges of remote work is for an introvert, like, how do you know when it's okay to speak up without being annoying? And so creating explicit rules that embrace it. Like I was just looking at a team's charter yesterday, and they have a thing that says, ask a question here. If you don't have an answer in 2 hours, you have our blessing to escalate it over here. Like, and so, okay, now I don't have to worry about that. I also know that if I didn't do that as part of the team, like I'm not contributing, participating, and people can escalate without feeling bad. Like um, there's also coming up with rules where what do you do when somebody's not online? Is it okay? When do I reach out? How do I reach out? Can I call their cell? Like we don't even have anybody's cell number. We don't. Like we're not going to call you. The only person who has is HR in case of emergency. If you disappear for 5 days, we never heard of you. We're going to call a loved one to make sure you're alive. Other than that, we don't use that as a communication channel. It's just not part of our makeup. And so agreeing on that as an organization creates a platform where people really understand what's expected, how to communicate. Because a lot of accountability fails sometimes are just communication fails. Like, and they have a lot to do with confusion between what's synchronous and asynchronous communication. I'll give you a tactical example. My wife will send me a WhatsApp message, an SMS for you Americans. And I'll look at it and be like, okay, I'll get to that when I want. And 2 minutes later, I'll see another. Did you see my message? I can see that you saw my message. Why aren't you replying? And the reason is in her head, SMS is synchronous. It is a conversation. Like it is supposed to go back and forth. For me, it's asynchronous. It's a thing of like, it's like email. I'll get to it when I get to it. And a lot of those sort of like interpersonal conflicts have to do with the fact that people haven't agreed on what is synchronous and asynchronous, and therefore get frustrated with each other.
That's a really good point.
That's one. Another is being very clear about the flow of work. So making sure that people know what's next, making sure that they know what's getting checked next, and not that I'm not talking about babysitting people. I'm making sure that flow is predictable and dependable. Like one of the biggest challenges I've always had as a parent is to be incredibly consistent so my kids can predict what the outcomes are going to be of their choices, so that if they do something, they don't get a different response each time, and then they're sort of paralyzed in decision making. And I'll admit, like, I'm not particularly good at that, and that is one of my challenges that I continue to work with. As a manager, there are like very common practices. We use Scrum, and so they could be on video, they could be written. Actually, we have teams that run it completely different ways. We have teams that check in 3 times a week, some that check in every day, some on video. But having a point of conversation where you can be like, well, since last time we met, I was expecting you. What did you do? Do you need any help with anything? What are you going to do next? And off you go. And being able to have that flow of work be tracked and shaped. And also building a culture of, well, if there's a pause, if I'm blocked on something, how do I go find other things to do? I don't just sit there. So making sure that there's a really well-groomed backlog of work so that there's never a point where, sometimes projects delay. Well, if a project delays, that's not an individual contributor's fault, but it is the management team's responsibility to have valid and useful and valuable things for them to work on. So making sure that there's a consistent stream of work. Also making sure that your tooling contributes to a lot of this. Some of it is just honestly having source control. That's a very coder way to say it, but the reality is work should never live on your computer. It should live online, whether that's using Google Docs. Like if somebody goes out on parental leave and everybody loses access to a bunch of work for 2 months, that's no good. It needs to be in a way that's accessible, reviewable, collaboratable. So whether you're using, Dropbox to share things, or Google Drive, or a Jira, or whatever it is, that your tooling is always online, that people are always sharing that work, so it's accessible at all times, so nothing's ever trapped. Like we have a running joke that the biggest sin an engineer can say is it works on my computer, which is like, I don't care if it works on your computer. What it matters is, does it work in the place everybody else can see it and engage with it and give feedback to it and collaborate on it? And that's true for all kinds of work.
Shane, that's such a great point, because I think about working in the office, someone could just come over and say, can you share that file? But when you're managing people in different countries, if you don't have access to it, you can't move with this flow of work, like you're saying. One of the things that you mentioned earlier that can be a problem, like, you're not giving out employee cell phone numbers. I assume part of that is so that they can maintain some sort of work-life balance. And one of the big challenges with remote work is knowing when to turn on and off. That's why, like in France, they have the right to disconnect. You can't message an employee after office hours. What do you recommend to employees to maintain work-life balance while being remote?
I'll be honest, it's really hard. There are some like very simple tactics, but those tactics in some ways have a bit of privilege to them. And so I'll admit it. Like if you have the opportunity to create a fully separate workspace, if you have a spare bedroom, if you have access to a co-working space, not everybody has that. And so like to say it flippantly is sort of unreasonable, but to create places that are defined as a place for work, and then to basically be like I have a rule: never work in your bedroom. That's for me. You can work in your bedroom, I don't care. But for me to sleep at night, I've had to learn I can't have the bedroom be a place that my brain engages with work. And so defining physical spaces that you cross. Calendaring is one of those, like, uh, I live and die by my calendar. I didn't used to, but I learned that if I didn't do that, my wife likes to tease me that as a business owner, I can work half days, any 12 hours I want. And so for me, that challenge has always been drawing lines, like, because I have fun and my business is where I get the most of my energy. And so it's very easy for me to put more and more. And so being able
The
to draw
common
lines.
entrepreneur dilemma.
Yeah. And so that's part of that is commitments. Like I asked my wife last week, hold on, I got to just tell my next meeting that I'll be there in 2 seconds. Uh, we do regular biannual check-ins with each other. It's sort of just like a marriage retreat between ourselves. And I just asked her, I was like, hey, if there's one thing I could do to make you feel more loved that I could tangibly do right now, what I do? And she's like, you know what? If you shifted our family time to start at 5 instead of 6, that would make my life a lot better. Like I'd really, really appreciate that. And I was like, okay. And so, I went in and I had to go to a bunch of people and be like, hi, I'm prioritizing my marriage right now, which means I gotta change a lot of meetings. I'm sorry. But having that calendar in that space but also pre-filling personal things in that calendar. I have surfing in my calendar. My team knows not to try to move my surfing blocks. I have other things, and these are things that I make sure to sort of put those big blocks in first, because the urgent will always fill the rest of my calendar. I have to put the important in before the urgent just like goes over it like a tsunami.
You have to get good at self-management. That's a huge
Mm-hmm.
skill to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of companies right now are thinking about moving to hybrid or remote first or remote only, or might in the future. What is your best advice to them to have a successful transition?
Um, be real clear about outcomes. Um, get your management, your leadership aligned. Like I know a lot of companies where the leadership has given one set, but the management is trying to run it with a different set of tools or practices, and that conflict is just causing harm everywhere. The number of people I've heard in my friend groups be like, well, the CEO announced we're now remote first, but my manager is watching my clocking and whether or not I'm in here. And they're like, I don't know what to do. So alignment is like a really big one. Also consider that whatever culture you have now that you got from presential probably has about an 18-month to 2-year shelf life. You can probably run on that. At that point, there'll be enough churn that you're going to have to intentionally design whatever's next. And don't assume that the culture you design for a presential organization should be one-to-one with a remote organization. There are tweaks you're going to want to make. And so thinking about those ahead of time rather than trying to react and change something that isn't working.
Yeah, it's like slow and steady wins the race. Like don't rush into trying to make everyone remote or in hybrid environments right now. Like just, step by step, tweak the things in the culture, because it's really a big behavior change, not just for the CEO, but for everyone, managers,
So
employees.
the biggest thing I've seen that orgs struggle with are split orgs. My one recommendation is create a level platform for everybody. If like I've seen orgs where 8 people on one team are presential and 2 are fully remote, and it's always a disaster. Those fully remote people always feel ostracized, always miss out on key conversations, rarely get access to raises and promotions in the way, and it's like it doesn't work. So if you're going to create some kind of split org, even if you do have access to an office space, you need to behave remote first. All meetings have to be online, even if person A sits at this desk and person B sits at that desk. You have to create a level playing field for everybody. Otherwise, it gets even to the point where this caused us a problem. We had a rule for a while that if there were more than people in a city and they wanted to use their allowance, we give everybody an allowance for office, whatever, to do an office, I'll sign the lease. I don't mind. And we've had offices all over when there was enough. And the Minneapolis office got big enough that it actually started to cause cultural problems because people are like, there's a little too much density of leadership there. And so people there are getting access to leadership in ways other people don't, created resentment, it caused problems. And we eventually disbanded it for that reason. We're like, hey, it's not in line with the culture that we want to generate. So it can have those challenges, even when you're a remote first org.
Definitely. And what do you think the future is for remote work?
That's a weird one because I think it's just work. I think we're at a point in general where you see things like airlines announcing that business travel, in large part, they expect to be a significant thing of the past. It used to be a huge part of their revenue. It's going away because people realized, I can do a lot of these meetings online. It's just fine. I think you're going to continue to see that evolution of work being very dynamic. You're going to see a very big change of location. Like a friend of mine and I often say, if you want to see what remote workers do, look at what retirees do. Where would you go if it didn't matter? If your income was not tied to where you are, what would you do? You go somewhere warm with good schools, good medical care, and that's affordable. And so there's a reason that Florida saw a boom. There's a reason that the Canaries is seeing a boom, that these kinds of places that lead to a very attractive lifestyle. And so that pressure, that demand is going to cause a change in work, is my expectation, as people's priorities continue to shift.
Yeah, and a lot of people already moved over the past 2 years to be maybe closer to family, friends, or to be in a beautiful place like where you are. They probably don't want to move back. So it is permanent change because they've gotten used to the new life that they're living, and a decent percentage of them are enjoying it. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective, Shane.